Assalamu alaikum my dear students. Today I will tell you about the diffusion across the respiratory membrane part 2. So talking about the difference, that what is the difference between the alveolar air, alveolar air and atmospheric air. So we know that air comes from the atmosphere through the trachea into the alveoli like this. Let's suppose this is the trachea and this is our alveoli. So atmospheric air comes in here and here it reaches the alveoli for the gases exchange. Now the difference between the atmospheric air and the alveolar air is that air, when comes into the alveoli, gets humidified. So the difference is the number one is humidity level. The humidity level of the alveolar air is greater as compared to the atmospheric air. Atmospheric air is dry, but it gets humidified in the respiratory tract. Second is that when the air reaches the alveoli, the gases exchange occurs. Oxygen gets absorbed in the capillary, which is surrounded by the capillaries here. These are the red blood cells here, and the carbon dioxide is diffused into the alveoli. So gases exchange occur. So these are the two differences which are present between the alveolar air and the atmospheric air. So after this I will tell you about that. Now we know that the pressure of alveolar air must not exceed 760 millimeter of mercury. We know that the pressure of air must not exceed 760 millimeter of mercury in the alveoli. So actually what happens that the air has been humidified, so water has been added. So and oxygen, and the partial pressure of oxygen which is present in the alveolar is 159 millimeter of mercury. So now water is added, so it doesn't mean that the pressure would go 770. It would not happen. But what would happen that the partial pressure of oxygen would become 149 millimeter of mercury after the humidification, when the air would be humidified. So now talking about the mechanism of the exchange of gases that occur between the alveoli and the atmosphere. So what actually happens that not the whole air that is present in the alveoli gets exchanged at one time with the atmospheric air that is coming from the outside, but what happens that the gases exchange occurs interval by interval. So at one breath this amount of air would be exchanged by the atmospheric air, then after the second breath this amount of air would be exchanged, then like this. And so after the what happened that after 16 times the whole air that is present in the alveoli would get exchanged by the external air. So this why it is a slow process of this exchange, because in order to avoid the abrupt changes that would occur in the blood, if that process would have been fast, so what would happen that there would be abrupt changes in the blood. So that's why the nature has created this process slow, and after 16 times the whole air that is present in the alveoli gets exchanged with the external air. So now talking about the oxygen concentration of partial pressure in the alveoli. So normally what happens that we know that 4.2 liter of air gets exchanged between the alveoli and the atmosphere. So in this 4.2 liter, 250 ml per minute of oxygen gets exchanged in the normal circumstances, and during the exercise it becomes 1000 milliliter per minute. So in the normal circumstances 250 milliliter of oxygen is being getting exchanged per minute. So at that time the rate of breathing would be also normal. So ventilation would also be normal. Ventilation would be normal, or you can say ventilation would be slow as compared to this exercise state. So what happens during exercise? 1000 milliliter of oxygen per minute gets exchanged, which means that the rate of breathing would be more and the ventilation would be more as compared to the normal circumstances. So that is about the oxygen concentration. Now talking about the carbon dioxide concentration, that how much of carbon dioxide gets diffused from the capillary into the alveoli. So CO2 concentration. So what happens during the normal circumstance? 200 ml per minute of CO2 gets diffused from the capillary into the alveoli, and during the exercise 800 milliliter per minute gets diffused from the capillary into the alveoli. So now what happens that the quantity, the amount of carbon dioxide actually you can say determines that how much partial pressure of carbon dioxide is present in the alveoli. So during the normal circumstances 200 ml per minute a carbon dioxide is diffused from the capillary into the alveoli. So partial pressure of carbon dioxide would be 200 ml per minute. So in the case of 800 ml per minute during the exercise, so the more carbon dioxide would be diffusing from the capillary into the alveoli, so more would be the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli. So in short, if I summarize this point, that amount of carbon dioxide being diffused from the capillary into the alveoli determines the amount of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air. So that's all about the CO2 concentration. Now talking about the composition of the expiratory air. The air that is getting expired from the respiratory tract out of the mouth, what is the composition of it? So composition of expiratory air. So composition of expiratory air is composed of, you can say, alveolar air and the dead space air. We know that what is the dead space air? Dead space air is the air that is not exchanged and it's present in the respiratory tract. So dead space air plus alveolar air actually composes the expiratory air that gets expired out from the respiratory tract into the atmosphere via mouth. So now talking about the membranes of the respiratory tract. Membranes of the alveoli and the capillary through which the gaseous exchange actually occurs. So I would tell you now that how many barriers does oxygen have to cross in order to get diffused into the blood. So this is the alveoli. Okay, now you would have to follow me. Now first of all, it is the surfactant. This is the surfactant. Then here becomes the alveolar epithelium. Then becomes here the basement membrane of the alveoli. Basement membrane of alveoli. Then here it is the interstitial fluid. This is the interstitial fluid. Then becomes the capillary endothelium. This is the capillary endothelium. And then at the last it is the basement membrane of capillary. Basement membrane of capillary. Then it is the basement membrane of the capillary. So this whole surface is 0.2 millimeter thick. So oxygen has to cross this 0.2 millimeter of area to get diffused into the blood. So the thickness of this membrane that the oxygen has to pass through is 0.2 millimeter. So oxygen has to cross this 0.2 millimeter of the area of barrier in order to reach the blood and get diffused. So you can see that also that capillary is so strongly associated with the alveolar epithelium or alveolar membrane. Why? Because in order to ensure the maximum gases exchange between the alveoli and the blood. So this was my second part of lecture by the name diffusion across the respiratory membrane. The other things I would tell you in the third part. Thank you.